Welcome to the Faith and Culture Now podcast. I'm Scott Schiffer, and today I'm honored to be joined by Reverend Ben Duhal of Christ Lutheran Church here in Dallas, Texas. Reverend, it's so nice to be with you today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, well, today we're going to be talking about just the distinctives and the characteristics of the Lutheran tradition. And so I want to begin by just asking you, what are some of the sort of, cliff note history of the Lutheran Church and how it got started and where it is today?
The Lutheran tradition usually traces our history back to the life and work of Martin Luther, who was an Augustinian friar born in the late 15th century in Germany, what's now Germany. And he was an Augustinian friar, and he was steeped in the theology and the scriptural studies of his day, which led him into was a interpreter and sometimes critic of the ministries and the doctrines that he encountered at that time and place. Most famously, he is identified, and we are identified with controversy about the sale of indulgences, and with his 95 Theses concerning the sale of indulgences, which were, depending on which source you trust, were either sent by mail to the Archbishop of Mainz or nailed to a church door in Wittenberg, Germany. And we like to use the nailed to the church door story because it's a little more colorful. From that moment, more or less, on, the forming arguments and polemics that Luther got involved in sort of spread. They changed, they involved new people, new issues. And within a few years, you have the beginnings of what you would call what would later be called Lutheran theology, which becomes formalized through certain official documents, most famously the Augsburg Confession from 1530, and then becomes institutionally formed in the regions of Western Europe where the princes or rulers embraced the Augsburg Confession or the Reformation. In those countries, some kind of structure, some kind of definition needed to be developed for life after communion with the Church of Rome. And since you mention it, the technical definition of Lutheranism is essentially contained in this book, which is called the Book of Concord. These are the documents from the original generation of the Reformers, plus the decades that followed, that attempted to formulate and define what it meant to be a member of this church or to be a minister in this church. And that is still in force today. So anyone who does what I do, you have to promise to teach in accordance with this forbidding volume of 16th century theology.
Very good. So for people that come to visit a Lutheran church today, what are some things they can expect to see in a worship service?
Lutherans have developed a lot of diversity in worship and a lot of diversity in how we organize themselves. Some Lutheran churches will look and feel very similar to Roman Catholic churches. Some Lutheran churches will feel a little bit more like, a non-denominational style of worship. Those things, that diversity is all developed over the years. In general, what you're going to find in most Lutheran churches will be an emphasis on the by which we mean, first and foremost, the preaching of the word, the public reading and the public preaching of Scripture, specifically oriented around the gospel. And by that, we don't mean the four books of the evangelists, but around God's promises or good news, which we hold to be contained in the Old Testament and in the New Testament and in every genre in the Scriptures. So there would be an emphasis on preaching both law, God's commands, and gospel, God's promises, hearing those in the words of Scripture being read and in the preaching of the pastor, and also an emphasis on the presence of God through the sacraments. So Lutherans hold to two sacraments, two sort of visual or tangible promises ordained by Christ for our salvation: baptism and Holy Communion. So you are in many Lutheran churches today, you'll come in, there will be singing, there'll be music, hymns, so forth, prayers. But the heart of Lutheran worship is going to be the preaching of the word and the celebration of the sacrament of Holy Communion.
Very good. I'm just curious, in Lutheran traditions, do people typically, do they pass the sacraments around through the church, or do people come to the front to take communion? And, is there one cup? Are there many cups? How is that typically done in a Lutheran tradition?
Great question. That's another practice that isn't really specified for us in our foundational documents. So there's no one answer for how it's going to be done. However, it's going to be more common and more quote unquote traditional for Lutherans to come forward to receive the sacrament, standing or kneeling. Behind us is an altar rail where people in this church kneel to receive the sacrament. And there will be usually a shared chalice or two, depending on it. But that being said, there are certainly many churches that have pre-filled cups. It's relatively rare to have it pass through the seats. A distinction that does, in fact, go all the way back to the 16th century between what became Lutheranism and the Reformed tradition. So we preserved coming forward and leaving your seat to come up to the altar. Whether you receive it in a little tiny glass or a larger chalice, whether you drink it or dip or do something else, that's somewhat less
Sure.
important.
That makes sense. So the other sacrament you mentioned is baptism. What is a little bit of the Lutheran understanding of baptism?
Baptism in the Lutheran understanding is it's an efficacious sacrament, meaning that it works by God's will and ordinance, not by human will to receive. We follow the sort of ancient and medieval consensus of the church in baptizing people at whatever age, so from infant to the end of life, you can be baptized. We only baptize once. We do not believe that baptism can be repeated.
Mm-hmm.
So because it is a promise from God, because it's a trust from God, it can never be revoked. It can never be effaced. It can never be undone. So what baptism is for us is the forgiveness or remission of original sin and the promise of God to continue forgiving sins, in effect, for the sake of repentance and faith. So when someone is baptized, if they're a child or an infant, they're brought up. If they're old enough to speak for themselves, they come up, but always with a sponsor, always with the community being represented. We do baptisms only in the context of Sunday worship. We don't, except for emergencies, we don't do baptisms privately, because the whole church is involved. And the pastor, the person who's administering baptism, speaks the sort of the promises of God, which we connect going back to Luther all the way through creation, the flood, the rescue of Israel through the Red Sea, all of these stories of salvation through or by means of water. And then we say, basically, you're now a part of this. And so we say that the sinful human nature, the old Adam, if you will, is sort of drowned in baptism, and the baptized puts on Christ as a new identity, as a garment. And baptism is very important to us because we view every day as a kind of return to baptism. This is a one-time event that it happens, and then it kind of, it just happens and it's over. It's an identity that we are continually being renewed in. So whenever we confess our sins, whenever we receive words of absolution, we understand it as a return to baptism. In the late medieval church, when Luther was kind of coming up and getting educated, baptism was understood as the sort of first plank of the shipwreck.
Sure.
Right. So human nature shipwrecks, original sin comes into the world, and baptism was the first thing you held on to. And then confession and absolution were the second plank. So when baptism sort of stopped working, you'd have that to cling to. And Luther moved away from that understanding toward baptism as being a new identity, a consecration to the royal priesthood of God's people, and to this kind of lifetime of forgiveness of sins and service out of a position of pure generosity and the security that comes from knowing that you're embraced by God, of service to anyone who is in need.
Yeah. Almost like when you get baptized, you're saying, I've committed to live a different life from this point forward. I mean, obviously with, young kids, they may not fully grasp that, but,
Mhm.
an older person coming forward, they would have this idea that once I've been initiated here, then I have a responsibility to not only to God, but to the community of faith as a result of making this decision.
Right. Well, right. And I think we would usually phrase it as it's baptism is God's commitment to us, God
Okay.
making a commitment to us. And our response to that is supposed to be is ideally is understood to be this faithful response. I respond in faith, I respond in obedience, I respond in acts of love and generosity. But whether I do that or not, God's commitment to me isn't changed. So that's an important emphasis for us
It,
when we talk about
it
baptism.
reminds me of the verse in the New Testament where Paul says that even when I'm unfaithful, God is still faithful.
Exactly, exactly.
So
Yes.
very good. So with regard to churches, oftentimes people who are involved in the community in any given congregation tend to have sort of different proclivities towards certain different social issues. What are some of the big social issues that the Lutheran Church is concerned with today? Maybe not this congregation specifically, but just sort of in general.
Historically, the Lutheran churches grew out of state churches in Germany and in Scandinavia. And in that sense, there's a historical similarity with the Anglican tradition. And so that relationship as an official church, in effect, which you were enrolled by default, and one that was supported by the patronage and the protection of the princes, along with some theological commitments that the Lutheran tradition had, made us churches that were generally socially fairly moderate, politically connected to the the state.
Mhm.
And so historically our biggest kind of contribution to Christian social doctrine has been at the level of charity or relief, the organization of relief for poverty, hunger, medical care, education. That was a major emphasis early on during the Reformation. Areas that were Lutheran in their and there was major advocacy for educating as many children as possible, including girls, which was a controversial thing at the time. So a history of charitable endeavors and what I would call kind of good government engagement. What changed in the U.S. context was first and probably most significantly because we were primarily an immigrant church in the 19th century and into the beginning of the 20th century. And then again, because so many of the countries from which we trace our roots were combatants during the world wars, and there was a huge flow of refugees, we developed a strong ministry toward immigration and refugee welcoming and resettlement. That's still a major theme in North American Lutheranism today. There are a few church groups that do a large share of refugee resettlement, and we're a part of that and always have been. So that's one area, and that continues to be a major theme, accompanying migrants, providing humanitarian relief in the context of people who are having their asylum claims adjudicated, people who are refugees waiting for resettlement or who have been approved for resettlement and need a place to live. They need to get set up. We have a long history of that, and that continues. And that's one major area. Another area in which Lutherans have traditionally been active and still are is in healthcare, developing health systems, hospitals, foster care in Texas in particular, and in many places in the country, providing foster homes
Mhm.
has been a major, and that goes back to past eras where orphanages were more common. So all of those things are very important. Today, you'll see Lutheran churches having a lot of the debates that other churches have about kind of cultural and political issues. Those tend to break down along fairly similar lines within our congregations and the denominations that make up Lutheranism in the U.S.
Yeah,
So,
that makes sense. sort of like there's a lot of emphasis on some of the teachings in the book of James with regard to the orphan and the widow, and he talks about true religion is helping those in need, right? And it sounds like Lutherans have had a real heart for those who are neglected or ostracized or pushed to the outer reach of society.
Yes. And the criticism that goes along with it that is that we have tended historically to be somewhat less clear or less visible in questions of political justice or oppression. And that probably relates, there's some theology behind that, but there's also our history as state churches. How critical are you going to be of the state that is funding and protecting you? So we've excelled at that kind of humanitarian ministry. We've had some real work to do when it comes to, what is our voice when we're dealing with legally structured or economically driven injustice. We had a lot of leaders, clergy leaders in the civil rights movement in the U.S. and in dealing with questions of war and peace. We like to talk a lot about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was a Lutheran theologian in 20th century Germany, very, very well known and revered now. And so we've tried to look at some of those voices to say, how can we recover a properly theological attitude towards questions of right and wrong in the public sphere? And that's an ongoing project.
Yeah, I think that's important. And, sort of on the flip side of that, some other denominations, like I'm, Baptist, and in the Baptist tradition, you sort of face having too much say about government to the point where some people embrace like Christian nationalism, where you sort of convolute your faith and your commitment to your government as if it's one and the same, and
Yes.
it shouldn't be. So I think that's sort of an area where probably a lot of denominations could do a better job, but it's hard to sort of find that middle ground where, what you're saying is clear, but it's not compromised by either swinging too much in favor of the government or too much against the government, or whatever else the case may be.
Yes, and that's generally, historically, you will find people from Lutheran churches in positions of responsibility, but not necessarily being very vocal about that or about their Lutheran faith informing what they do. This is both a genuine praise and kind of gentle criticism. We make excellent bureaucrats. We're really good at things. And that goes at the level of our charities. If you're Lutheran World Relief, which does various kinds of disaster response around the world, I mean, they're very effective. They're very well administered. Turning that into an explicit faith claim is something we tend to not be as adept at, or we don't have the same experience with.
Sure, that makes sense. Yeah, with a lot of Baptists, with their missions endeavors, it's frequent that I think that the gospel comes ahead of the relief. But both are important. You've got to do both. And if you're not meeting people's physical needs, they're probably not going to be in a place where they can hear the gospel. In the same way, if you are meeting physical needs but not really dealing with the gospel, then some of their spiritual needs may not be being met. But what I think I hear you saying is that for Lutherans, meeting the needs is important. It's sort of a way of living out your faith. And so for Lutherans who are committed to their congregations, their church, they're going to be involved in some kind of social charity as a way of expressing their faith in Christ.
Yes, that's a good way to put it. In one of Martin Luther's very influential treatises, it's a short work that can be read. It's widely available online in different translations for free, I think, called "The Freedom of a Christian." And he says that a Christian is the perfectly free ruler of all, and at the same time the completely bond servant of all. And that's a paradox that kind of goes through our theology and our practice in a lot of different ways. The idea both that Christ achieves all righteousness for you, that he fulfills God's will for you completely without any contribution on your part, but also that when you're baptized, you become, and this was Luther's word, a Christ, a a anointed person for the sake of your neighbor. You in turn, are supposed to act with that same kind of completely free self-giving, which doesn't seek to earn anything for itself. And so it's a theme that goes through everything we do, and it's both a real strength and a real point of vulnerability in our history and in our life as a tradition, that we stress both this complete freedom and this complete obligation at the same time as a way in which our faith is made real.
People should be able to see Christ in us, but we should also be sharing God's kingdom with people.
Exactly. Yes.
So another question is, if someone was going to be, say, looking into the Lutheran Church, what are some things that would sort of attract someone to become part of the Lutheran denomination?
It's a great question. And I'll speak primarily for myself here, because I didn't grow up going to church outside of a very brief period when I was baptized as a 8-year-old. But I did, for all intents and purposes, come to all of this as a young adult. And I learned about it more or less with fresh eyes at that point in my life. The things that I think are most important and that I would hope would be attractive to people who are visiting a Lutheran church or encountering Lutheranism from a place of open-mindedness is, first, the particular emphasis that we have on grace. Everything in church and everything in the scriptures, in everything that we do, is being, first, a gracious gift from God, and second of all, a means of receiving grace for ourselves. And so we talk about this in the scriptures. For example, Martin Luther was a translator of the scriptures. He was a scholar of the Old Testament in particular, and he lectured. I've got a volume of his lectures. These are just his lectures from 1535 on the first 4 chapters of Galatians. So, this is the kind of, time and care he took speaking to his students about the scriptures. But we don't just look at the scriptures as just like a generically true thing or a repository of information from God. We look at it as the way that God speaks to us, primarily in terms of law, that is, commands or requirements, and in terms of gospel, promises and grace. So the clarity of grace is something that I want everybody to hear in a Lutheran church. The other thing, and this is related, is that's important to me and that I would hope would be appealing to people, is that we believe in the objective action of grace through the sacraments. So in other words, you might come to church and think, I'm really not feeling it today. Jesus is in his tomb. The angels are silent. God's not in his heaven, and I am cold as a stone today. But the truth is, you're still baptized. You are still invited forward to the altar, and God shows up in those things, in the bread and the wine and in the water, regardless of my own state of mind. And I personally find that very comforting. I find it very comforting that I don't need to work myself into a certain state of mind, or, as they called it theologically, a disposition to receive grace. I show up and God is already there. God is already promising to be present to me in certain ways without my having to be any kind of person at all. I feel like that's very important. That's something that I come back to over and over again, and that I always want to leave people with when they come here.
Yeah, I think that's very important. Anybody has times where they feel like they're just not connecting with God. Oftentimes, when you're not involved in a church community, it's real easy to feel like, is God there? I feel alone in all of this. And part of coming to the community is to be reminded that we're all together in this. And so the emphasis on the fact that, yes, God is here, whether you feel it or not, he's here, he's present. And what we're doing together is a reminder that we are the same as the body of Christ.
Yes, and that's something that's very important to us historically. The worship life of the church in the 16th century, when Martin Luther and the other reformers were doing their work, was something that everybody kind of deplored, no matter what their theological position. And it was really important to Luther to say, don't go. I mean, if you want to go on a pilgrimage, fine, go on a pilgrimage. If you want to, do your own devotions, that's fine. But really, your parish church, that's a place that should be for you. That's where you should go to meet God, and you should do it regularly. So that's something that I think that's by no means unique to Lutheran Christianity. Everybody emphasizes that now, but it's something that is part of our kind of DNA.
Yeah.
That you go to church because God is reliably there waiting for you.
Yeah. It should be a place of, if you will, rest, a place of solace, a place of encouragement, a place of communion with other believers. But you should always be able to go to church feeling like, this in the place where I'm going, I know that I'm going to be taught and it's going to facilitate my walk.
And that means also, as a practical matter, that we try to leave as much as possible to the freedom of people's conscience, meaning that because we try to focus with clarity on law, on what is commanded and what is promised, we tend to not be really interested in, what's a Christian lifestyle, what's a Christian way to run a household, what are, people's roles supposed to be. We're not real big on that.
Yeah.
Because we really think, that the key thing to focus on is what does God communicate through those things. So you're not going to hear a lot of preaching from Proverbs in Lutheran churches. You're not going to hear. I mean, James, we read James on our lectionary cycle. You're going to hear about it because it's so strong ethically. But there's a lot of stuff that we don't really concern ourselves with too much, because we don't think it belongs to the heart of the gospel message.
Sure. It sounds like you give a lot of freedom to people to say, okay, I'm part of this church. I feel convicted of this at home, so this is how I'm going to run my house. This other person in my same congregation feels convicted to do things a little differently. That's how they're going to run their house, and that's okay. Is that sort of what I'm hearing a little bit? Or at least as a church, we're not going to dictate that.
Yeah. We don't say, unless you discipline your child this way, you're not a good Christian or something like that. That
Right.
would not be, that would be very unusual to hear in a Lutheran context. And beyond this, it goes back historically to the idea that vocation is a religious vocation. So if you go back to the 15th century, there was a sense of there were religious, that term being used as a kind of community, a kind of a vocation to monastic life, and then everyone else is just being, doing whatever they did. And Luther really tried to emphasize that your vocation, your assignment from God, where you were in the world, was religiously important. If you raised pigs, raise your pigs as a Christian, that's just as important as praying in the chapel all day. And I think that had kind of carried over to the idea that there are all kinds of ways you can be a Christian. I mean, there's all kinds of ways you can live out those promises that God makes to you in your baptism. And so we try not to set up distinctions where they don't need to be.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's always controversial, and we're always trying to figure out what is and isn't essential. But that's the mindset, I would say.
I think that's very good. That's very helpful. So, sort of in summarizing some of the things we've talked about, the Lutheran tradition arose out of the teachings of Martin Luther during the Protestant Reformation. Has over time gone from European cultures to the American culture, but even the American culture here was founded on people who had come over here as minority groups. And as such, the heart of the Lutheran Church in the States has always had a real soft spot for helping the foreigner, helping the one who has been displaced or is a refugee. And that the heart of the Lutheran Church is the gospel message. And the gospel message is physically observed through baptism as one sacrament, through the communal taking of the Lord's Supper as a second sacrament. And there's a lot of freedom in Lutheran churches to then sort of go from those essentials to the specifics of how they're going to do their own worship, whether it be more high church like a Roman Catholic Church, or whether it be a little bit more low church, like some of your non-denominational Protestant churches. And on the whole, the Lutheran Church gives a lot of room for people in their conscience to make their own decisions and decide how they're going to serve and how they're going to do charitable acts or other things of that nature that are important to being part of how we live out our faith.
That's very well said. And I'll add, I didn't get into this, but for a lot of historical reasons, much of them having to do with European colonialism, there is now very large Lutheran churches in sub-Saharan Africa. There are smaller Lutheran churches in Latin America and in some Asian countries. But today, the countries with the largest Lutheran populations, I believe, I could be remembering this wrong, but I think the first is maybe Sweden, and I believe the second is Ethiopia, the second largest Lutheran church in the world. So it is a movement that has gone well beyond its Northern European roots. It has taken root in different cultural contexts. I like to think that that's happened, at least in part, because there is some truth. We never claim to be the only church or the apostolic church. We always want to be a movement for the good of that whole church. But I do like to think that it means that there is some insight there. There's something from God that has allowed this work of a very obscure friar from a very small town in Germany to have changed Christianity in this way.
Yeah, and there's no doubt that Luther's contributions to Christianity really did spur lots of worldwide change for the church. I mean, his works indirectly affected more or less every Protestant denomination that we have today.
Yes.
And it's nice to be able to say, yeah, we try to follow the teachings of this particular prior who did come from a very small, kind of, not really, I guess, I mean, by some standards, insignificant, but certainly not, he wasn't, he didn't grow up in the Vatican. He was out in the country.
Wittenberg was not a big city, and it was not a prominent university at the time. And that's how God works in the world. And if I could leave you with maybe one, essential thought about Luther from Luther, and something that I think has gained a lot of kind of purchase in Christianity more generally. It's Luther's idea from a 1518 document that he wrote called the Heidelberg Disputation. You can look it up, it's online, where he talked about being a theologian of the cross, by which he meant that you look for God. A theologian of the cross looks for God in suffering, in things that are rejected and despised, whereas a theologian of glory looks for God in the goodness of things that are visible. And he says this is the task really of theology, is to become a theologian of the cross, to emphasize what Christ does for you, and to not be deceived by human categories of goodness, excellence, beauty. I think that's a very important insight, and that's something that has had a lot of influence.
I think that directly influenced Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who you mentioned earlier, and that sort of leads into his teachings on cheap grace versus costly grace, and his idea and push that to be followers of the gospel, it's going to cost us something. If we are looking for a theology of the cross, and looking for suffering, we're going to have to go to where that suffering is. And I think that played into, of course, all the work that he did in his ethics and his desire to help those who were suffering in the Holocaust and so on.
Yes, absolutely. He was a very, very able explicator of that idea, and the idea that God's goodness is in that sense hidden. It's hidden in the cross rather than revealed through visible works of glory and beauty. And that's something that I think I have to come back to over and over again as a leader. And it's something that I have to preach over and over again because it isn't intuitive, but it is deeply comforting when we think that it's willing and able to traverse that entire distance, to come to us in that humblest form.
Yeah, very good. Well, Reverend Ben, thank you so much for your time today. And for those of you watching or listening, thanks for your observance of this podcast. And we will see you again next time on the Faith and Culture Now podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you.